Yeah, so I'll start with our presentation by Lemontree, linking optimality theory, models, and experiments, and I'll jointly do this together with Nick Smith and Hugo de Boer. Oh, can you do the next slide, Hugo? Yes. So what we will talk about, I will give a short introduction about why we started the Lemontree project. Then Nick will talk about plant acclimation from an eco-evolutionary optimality theory. And then Hugo de Boer will show some results of experiments, but also show a little bit on how do we do some of these experiments. And then I'll take it back and do a short wrap up and also will lead the discussion. Next slide, please. Yes, so the introduction to the Lemontree project. Oh, yeah, next slide. So Lemontree stands for Land Ecosystem Models based on new theory, observations, and experiments. And what we want to do is to create a next generation model of the terrestrial biosphere in interaction with the carbon cycle, the water cycle, and the climate. Next slide, please. Because it's obvious that there is a tight link between the biosphere, the climate, and the atmospheric composition. And of course, with a changing climate, like you're also just referring to, it's very important to understand the role of the biosphere in this changing climate, also with a changing atmospheric composition of, for instance, CO2. So we think that ecosystem and Earth system models are designed to mimic this role. But of course, there's a big question to how do ecosystems change with changing climate, but also how do ecosystems themselves influence this changing climate? And we can try to model this, but when we do so and when we look at some of these model results, they're actually quite, next slide, they're actually quite in the mist, because there's a lot of uncertainty related to these Earth system models in looking at how they react to and how they also influence themselves the climate. Next slide. And so then there's, of course, two ways that we can go. What we have seen in the past is that we continue to add new processes to existing models so that existing Earth system models are getting more and more complex. But we could also look at new theory. Next slide. So what we would like to do is, rather than to keep on building on to these existing models, we want to create a new model based on this eco-evolutionary optimality theory that Nick will talk about. Next slide. And for that, we will use, well, I think that we can do this partly because there is already a lot of data out there. We really live in a world where there's loads of data, for instance, by remote sensing, tracers, eddy covariance, trait data, amongst others. There's a lot of data available to link to these new theories, but also we will use very targeted experiments where what Hugo will talk about further. So with that short introduction, next slide, I would like to give the word to Nick, who will explain a little bit more about the eco-evolutionary optimality theory.
Yeah, thanks, Karin. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the theory before passing it off to Hugo, who's going to talk about the experiments that we're using to test the theory. So next slide, please. So one aspect of the theory that we're trying to develop is responses of plants and ecosystems, and what I'm really going to talk about are leaves, to changing environmental conditions over sort of non-instantaneous timescales, over longer timescales. And so one process that describes this is acclimation. And you can kind of see this depicted here in what I've got shown on the y-axis is the rate of photosynthesis in two different plants or two different leaves. One that's acclimated to high light on the left, and one that's acclimated to low light on the right. And these are kind of instantaneous responses that change as a result of that plant adjustment to the different conditions that it's given. And this is something that these sort of acclimation processes are things that we hope our theory can replicate. So next slide, please. And the reason we want to replicate it is because acclimation is ubiquitous and well known. So plants acclimate to changes in CO2, changes in light, changes in temperature. Basically, if you alter the environmental conditions that a plant exists at, it's going to adjust to those conditions, and that's been well known for a long time. And these are just some representative papers, some of which were written before I was born. So pretty old, well-known things. So next slide, please. And it turns out that these acclimation responses can impact carbon cycling and climate. So I'm just cherry picking some work that I've done in the past where we've plugged in acclimation responses to changes in climate, and in this case, changes in temperature. And when you put these acclimation responses into models, because the carbon cycle and climate is so sensitive to photosynthesis, it really does change what these land surface models project for future carbon cycling and climate. Next slide, please. So the problem in the past was that Earth system models and the land surface portion of these Earth system models have relied on purely statistical representations of acclimation. And this leads to unreliable future predictions due to over-parameterization and the reliance on tuning. And so one example, again, kind of cherry picking problems with my own work. So we plugged acclimation into an Earth system model and found that it changed photosynthesis a bunch. That's the panel on the right. But our acclimation response came from this one figure on the left, and the relationship of a physiological parameter to some environmental condition. And of course, you can fit a line to these data, but as you can see, the data are kind of all over the place, and don't. So the environmental condition here is temperature, and so in this case, only goes from 11 degrees C to less than 30 degrees C. So it doesn't cover all the environmental conditions that we're trying to simulate on the globe. So this statistical representation is potentially problematic. Next slide, please. And so Lemontree is refining a theoretical model, or really a suite of theoretical models, but the one I'm going to talk about here is looking at photosynthetic acclimation. And our photosynthetic acclimation model is based on optimization and the first principles of plant physiological theory. And Sandy led this really nice paper recently, kind of outlining our approach, not just to photosynthesis, but to a variety of processes that we want to simulate with a land surface model. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the photosynthesis model a little bit. And it's based on this principle from least cost theory that optimally plants will maintain the fastest rate of photosynthesis at the lowest sum resource cost. And the costs for photosynthesis predominantly are water and nutrient uptake and use. Next slide, please. And so photosynthesis can be limited by a variety of environmental conditions, predominantly the availability of light to power the photosynthetic processes, as well as the availability of CO2 in the atmosphere, because CO2 is the substrate that's used by photosynthesis. And so our theory would posit that plants will set up their biochemistry, set up all the processes inside the leaf, such that they're equally limited by light and CO2, and not over-invested in the pieces used to take up and use CO2 or take up and use light. Next slide, please. And so from this theory, we can predict a variety of photosynthetic traits. I'm just going to show you an example of one trait, and that trait is the maximum rate of rubisco carboxylation, or VC max. And rubisco is just this enzyme that's inside the leaf that grabs CO2 out of the atmosphere and starts the photosynthetic process of making sugars. And so plants can adjust how much rubisco they have in their leaves. And this is something that we can predict from our theory. And these next couple of slides will just show you what some of those predictions look like. So next slide, please. In response to light availability, our theory would predict that this VC max, the amount of rubisco in the leaves, would increase. And it increases because there's more light available, allowing for greater electron transport to power photosynthesis. And so the plant needs more rubisco there to grab the CO2 and make use of that extra light that's available. Next slide, please. We also predict that the VC max will increase with temperature. One, because rubisco works faster when temperatures are higher, but also because the processes related to light acquisition and use also happen faster at higher temperatures. There's also a process called photorespiration, which I won't go into, but it also leads to an increase in VC max as well, or predicted VC max. Next slide, please. With elevated CO2, we would predict that the VC max would actually decrease. So if there's more CO2 inside the leaf, the plant doesn't need to have as much rubisco to take advantage of the light that's available to it. And so what a plant can do is downregulate the amount of rubisco in its leaves, and therefore not use as much nutrients to build that rubisco under elevated CO2. Next slide, please. We can also make predictions about how the soil environment might influence VC max. So as soil nitrogen limitation increases, we would expect that plants would actually downregulate their VC max and try to do that the optimal photosynthesis using other resources other than nitrogen, because rubisco is this very high nitrogen required enzyme. So we can make predictions about not only how these traits will change with above ground conditions, but also how they would change with below ground conditions as well. Next slide, please. I think is the last one. Yep. And so what's cool now is we can feed a model environmental conditions and predict what these optimally acclimated traits would look like. And again, here I'm just showing VC max, but there's a wide swath of traits that we can use to make these predictions just based on the environmental conditions that we feed to the model. And with that, I will hand it off to Hugo, who will talk about how we're testing this theory.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you very much for explaining the theory. So the situation we have now is that we have a very nice theory based on a very fundamental principle of optimality, which is rooted in evolution, and that we can use our model to well, actually generate results for many different things. So one of the things the model can do is generate spatial patterns of these photosynthetic traits. And actually, you can go outside and observe these patterns. You can collect data along environmental gradients, going up mountains or going from cold to warm climates or more cloudy to less cloudy environments to test the different predictions. Another way to test the model would be to look in the past, so go back to historic times where we had different climates, different CO2 levels, different temperatures, all that. The problem with these approaches is that you're not capturing the acclimation response that we are talking about in this specific presentation. So really trying to capture this relatively short-term acclimation response that would be typically in the timescale of, well, a few weeks, maybe a month, but not at the time scale of a generation of a plant. So that is the problem that we have now, that we really want to see, does our theory predict well these acclimation responses of plants? And it's not necessarily so that the responses of plants follow these optimality theory, because there's many physiological constraints that plants have to deal with. So for these considerations, we have devised several experiments. I'm not showing you all the experiments that we're doing, but I'm just highlighting a few very nice ones that we're working on now, that also reflect back on the different graphs that Nick showed before, so specifically light, temperature, CO2, and availability of nutrients. So before I go into the specific experiments, I would just like to show you a little bit what we do in terms of measuring photosynthesis. So what you can see here is our, let's say, our core equipment that we use to measure photosynthesis. And this is the LI 6400 or the LI 6800. I won't bore you with the details, but what you can see here in the picture is that basically there's a leaf chamber that you clip onto a leaf. In the chamber, there's a light source, there is CO2 control, there's humidity control, temperature control, there's air flowing through, and basically this machine, using infrared gas analyzers, can measure the exchange of CO2 and water vapor from the leaf, which you can then use to measure photosynthesis, transpiration, and many other physiological parameters that we have in the model as well. So dive a little bit more into the theory. I won't bore you to death with these things, but what you can see here on the left is that we actually have a leaf, and the stomata, the pores in the leaf surface, are typically on the bottom of the leaf. The top of the leaf is where the sunlight hits, and the photosynthesis is happening somewhere in the middle. What is the main challenge is that actually many of the photosynthetic traits that we are measuring are relying on what is the CO2 concentration inside the leaf, because this is the basic Michaelis-Menten chemical relationships that depend on the concentration of your chemical that you're working with. However, it's not that immediately possible to measure what is the CO2 concentration inside the leaf. So in order to actually approximate the CO2 concentration in the leaf, the machine uses a quite clever approach that combines the fluxes of water and CO2 in order to infer what are the resistances for water and CO2 across this leaf air interface, and thereby approximate what would be the CO2 concentration deep inside the leaf. Using this approach, you can actually plot these very nice curves that I'm showing here on the right, where you can plot on the x-axis the leaf interior CO2 concentration, and the y-axis you can plot the photosynthesis rate. And this relationship, what you can see here, is actually showing a process that is basically showing limitations to the process. One is related to the limitation of VC max that we talked about before, and the second process is the limitation to transport. The combination of these two processes is what's giving the specific photosynthesis shape, and these type of measurements is what we use to infer these traits and then to relate back to our models. So let me just show you some of the experiments that we have done and how the outcomes that we can use to test the models. So the first experiment is done by our PhD student Jan Langhorst, and he's looking at the acclimation of photosynthetic biochemistry in relation to the soil environment. So here we're specifically testing the influence of nutrients. Here we're using a greenhouse experiment, and our experimental setup is using two types of soil treatment. We have a natural soil that is quite rich in soil biota, which actually means fungi, bacteria that actually help make nutrients available, and one sterilized. And then in addition to that, we have actually 3 sand soil environments that we add artificial nutrients. We actually have quite low nutrients, medium amount of nutrients, and then quite high nutrients that relate to some extent to the natural soils that we have. We've done this experiment with 2 species, one grass species and one vine species that you can see here pictured. And we measured these photosynthetic response curves, and in addition to that, we also measure biomass, amount of roots, and then how much carbon and nitrogen is available in plant tissues. What you can see here in these panels here on the left, you can see the results for the grass, so for the Holcus lanatus, and you can see there's actually quite some big differences between what is the VC max, so this carboxylation rate, for the different nutrient treatments. So this would be the high, the medium, and the low. And it's very clear that the higher your nutrients are, the higher your VC max is. And this translates very nicely to the model. In the same way, we see the natural versus the sterilized soils showing a very similar response, where the soil with the natural soil biota with relatively high nitrogen availability has a higher VC max rate. So these results compare very nicely to the model that we have at the leaf level. Interesting to this very clear response is the response from the solanum, from the vine. And we see very little response, maybe a little bit in line with what we see with the grass, but definitely very minor responses. So these results are really contrasting the predictions of the model, which is quite interesting. I'm not showing here the results of the biomass, but actually what we do see is that actually this plant has much more plasticity in terms of how the resources are allocated in terms of leaves, stems, and roots, versus the grass that has less plasticity in the biomass and then allocates the resources in terms of developing different leaves. So these results are showing us that we actually not only need to take into account optimality in the leaf in terms of photosynthetic trait, but also take into account the plasticity that plants have in order how they can divide different tissues between allocating resources in the leaves, in the stems, and into the roots. So in this sense, the experiment is showing us new avenues to improve the model. A second experiment that I would like to share with you is the photosynthetic acclimation responses to CO2 across a soil nitrogen availability gradient. So this is by Evan, and what we are showing you here is a combination of how much nutrients are available to the plant and the CO2 environment in which the plants are growing. So the optimality theory is predicting that under higher CO2 concentrations, plants are investing less resources in their photosynthetic biochemistry. And when plants have more nutrients available, they would invest more of these nutrients in increasing their photosynthetic biochemistry. So the results that we are showing you here are very clear responses. So what you can see here, the colors between red and green are showing the different CO2 treatments. And very clearly, both the inoculated and the not inoculated plants are both showing typically higher VC max in the ambient CO2 concentration and lower VC max in the elevated CO2 concentration. So if plants indeed grow under higher CO2, they downregulate the investment in nitrogen in their tissues. In combination with that, we see very clearly a relationship between how much soil nitrogen is available for the plants, but this only works in the not inoculated plants. If they are inoculated, so that means if the soil has microbial communities that facilitate the uptake of nitrogen for the plants, we don't see this effect. So very clearly, the availability of nitrogen is influencing also the height of the VC max in combination with the availability of CO2 in the atmosphere. So the third experiment that I would like to show you, and this is actually by Nick, but I will just go over it. And this is about the acclimation of photosynthetic biochemistry in response to light availability. So again, we use a similar type of setup. So we're using growth chambers and manipulate how much light is available. So there are here 4 light treatments that have progressively higher percentage of shading. So 0 would be 0 shading and 80% would be 80% shading, so less light. Then there's 4 soil nitrogen treatments and actually 2 species. And again, the type of measurements that we do relate back to what is the photosynthetic biochemistry at the leaf level. So what you can see here is that if the percentage of shade increases, the VC max, so the photosynthetic biochemistry, is actually reduced. And on top of that, you see the effects of the fertilizer treatment, and you also see the species-specific differences for the experimental treatment, although the species are actually responding quite similarly. So it is very clear that the shading effects are confirming to our model predictions the same as the nutrient availability. So one of the key points that we get from these experiments is that we still have species differences that we cannot immediately explain based on optimality theory, just because there are so much fundamental differences between species. So that wraps up my presentation of the experimental results. And now I would like to give the word back to Karin.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, so I will keep the wrap up very short because I think we're already a little bit over time. And basically, yeah, so if we look back, then we looked at how Lemontree was started up, the development, and then we looked today at the optimality theory at leaf level, both from a theoretical and experimental perspective. I don't know if there's a time for a question or if you would like to continue with the next talk.
No, but I definitely
still
think
time.
like no, Karin, I think we definitely have time for a couple of questions. If anybody
That's great.
Would like to raise a hand, but in particular, just to set the ball rolling, it was said at the beginning that this optimality was evolutionary. Is that actually established, that what you defined as optimality is actually what plants do for evolutionary reasons? Or is that a theoretical supposition?
That's a good question. Nick, do you want to take that?
I can try. So one thing that we don't do with the theory is really parse out whether the responses that we see are due to evolution or due to within species variability. So processes like acclimation is even within an individual as well. But it's definitely the case that there's aspects of phenotypic plasticity, so within individual variation, as well as evolutionary dynamics that are driving those responses. And so one thing we haven't done, but would like to do is try and parse that out. So, to what degree can phenotypic plasticity reach optimality is something we don't know. And to what degree do you have to have these evolutionary changes driving these responses? At the leaf level, it seems phenotypic plasticity can allow for optimal traits to be seen, like we're seeing with these experiments that are just in individuals of single species. But obviously there's probably some limit, and that limit varies from process to process that we look at. So these sort of quick acting leaf level processes may be quite different than whole plant level processes.
Great.
Yeah,
thanks, Nick. I guess Sandy is not going to ask a question of her own team, but wants to interject.
I just wanted to interject a little bit here, which is to say we are talking about eco-evolutionary optimality, and this is based on the idea that the plants have been selected for the environment in which they are growing. Mm-hmm. And so we see acclimation and plasticity at an individual species level, but we also see species replacement along environmental gradients. So the traits vary along environmental gradients because different species come in because they're adapted to those particular environments. So it's just to give people a slightly broader vision of there is, there's good sense, there's good reason for thinking that there is natural selection at work here on several different timescales and space scales.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sandy. And just a last question from Paul.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. You're mentioning things like sensitivity to temperature. One thing I'm very interested in is how humidity over land is changing. So models predict, decreases in stomatal conductance, and that tends to decrease relative humidity, but it's less clear what's happening from observations. And I have little understanding of the land parameterizations, but I understand there's some uncertainty in how the dependence on humidity arises and what form it should have, which variable, which type of humidity variable should enter. So I was just curious if you think humidity is a big uncertainty, and if your experiments can control for it in a way that's informative, or indeed the optimality theory.
Yes.
So,
Yeah, I was going to give that to you, Hugo. Yeah.
okay. Yeah, so that's actually a very, very interesting point. And there's well, we can talk about it for an hour probably, but maybe I should give a very, very short answer. But the short answer is that if plants are exposed to higher humidity, they're actually like that to some extent because they transpire less. So photosynthesis becomes cheaper for them. Typically, they open the stomata. However, the consequences for what is then the biochemistry that differs quite a bit in terms of how they're functioning, what is their light environment. So for sure, there's going to be effects that we can try to predict with the models. And there's probably quite important feedbacks with the climate as well to take into account. So I think it's a very nice point. One big issue is that, let's say, varying humidity in a consistent way, both in the soil and the atmosphere in an experimental setup is not so easy because it's quite variable and very dependent also on temperature. So the key variable I think you want to consider is actually, from a plant perspective, the vapor pressure deficit, so the VPD. So yeah, that is quite a nice point to consider for climate science.
Okay, great. I think, thank you, Hugo and Karin and Nick. That was great. That was just fantastic, but we should crack on. So if you could stop sharing, and we've now got Greg Wagner from the Klima team, I think based in MIT. Greg, you there? There we are. There we go. Oh, there's one of his screens. Excellent. And great. And Greg will be talking about calibration of global ocean models. So over to you, Greg.
Thanks, Colm. So yeah, I'm Greg Wagner. I'm a research scientist at MIT, working with the Climate Modeling Alliance, and I work on the ocean component, as does the rest of the MIT group. And my talk today is about calibration of ocean models. And I guess, the talk is supposed to be about a big scientific question that we're tackling. So I'm going to say, I mean, the reason we are interested in calibrating global ocean models is to make accurate predictions of the state of the ocean in the future, for the purpose of making accurate climate predictions, because the ocean is an important component in the climate. And so one of the challenges for making accurate future predictions is, typically we have an ocean model that has many free parameters that have to be determined from observations or high resolution simulations. But one of the major challenges to calibrate these free parameters to represent a huge range of scales. So I'm kind of trying to illustrate the scope of the problem with these three animations. So on the far right, we have there's an animation of a large eddy simulation of boundary layer turbulence. That's turbulence in the upper 10 to 400 meters of the ocean, and these turbulent motions have scales of around 10 meters, 1 to 10 meters, and control vertical mixing in the ocean. If we zoom out just a little bit, but not all the way to the global scale, just a little bit to scales of 1 kilometer to 100 kilometers, we start to resolve processes that involve lateral heterogeneities, and we call this, in the ocean community, we call this mesoscale turbulence. And you can sort of see that the scale of the boundary layer turbulence in the patch that's represented by the simulation on the far right is just a tiny dot in the simulation in the middle. So we're zooming out by a factor of 100 when we go into the mesoscale turbulent regime. And mesoscale turbulent, but the thing is that mesoscale turbulence in most modern climate models is also not resolved. So if we go all the way to the left, That's a global ocean model with a scale of 1 degree, or about 100 kilometers. And that model, the physics in that model is sort of a viscous geostrophic balance. It's not, there's not a lot of, there's no eddies, and the time variability is very slow. So in order to make accurate predictions with the model on the left, we have to parameterize both boundary layer turbulence and mesoscale turbulence at the same time. And that's going to be what I'm going to talk about, is tackling that challenge. So just to motivate that problem, I'm presenting a case study in a bias that's common to many ocean models, which is a misprediction of the boundary layer depth in the southern oceans. That's illustrated by the figure on the right. This is from a paper published in 2018, illustrating that in the I think this is from the Southern Ocean spring. This particular model has a bias in the mixed layer depth. That's the layer over which properties are relatively mixed at the top of the ocean. The bias is on the order of 200 to 300 meters, which is about half of the total depth of the boundary layer. So that's a significant bias. But the problem is that this bias, this bias is due potentially to biases in both parameterizations or models for boundary layer turbulence and mesoscale turbulence. So mesoscale turbulence, what the parameterization for mesoscale turbulence is going to determine the interior stratification beneath the boundary layer and sort of sets the stage for boundary layer mixing. But it's boundary layer turbulence that ultimately deepens the boundary layer. So in an typical ocean model, we have parameterizations that represent both processes, but these processes are interacting to create the biases that we see that are common to so many models. So part of the challenge, what I'm going to pose is the challenge of calibrating a global ocean model is not just calibrating these parameterizations individually, but calibrating them jointly, potentially in some kind of integrated context, and potentially also coupled together. Okay, so how do we solve this? So now I'm gonna try to get into how we solve it, and I'll get to what I mean by a posteriori here on this slide. So I think that right now, in the current in our community, there's essentially two paradigms for model calibration. So if we represent a global ocean model as this sort of simple dynamical system, the phi model is the state of the model, and R model is the right-hand side, or whatever dynamics that we're trying to represent. And typically, this dynamical system depends not only on the state of the model, but also some free parameters that we need to find out in order to make accurate predictions. So one method for finding these free parameters, theta, is I refer to that as a priori or offline calibration. So typically, in that calibration mode, we find the optimal parameters theta star, which minimize a loss function that involves the difference between R, or potentially a component of the model of R, difference with some kind of observation of R. Right. And so one example is if you're trying to calibrate a model for fluxes, you can generate observations or synthetic observations of the fluxes, and then calibrate free parameters so that your flux model is close to the observed fluxes. The problem with this method, or the flaw of this method, and I wish I don't have a pointer, so I'm meant to have a pointer here, but the fundamental, so the salient feature of this method is that it's feasible with off-the-shelf methods for machine learning. You could also just simply you could use linear regression, for example, if you have data for the observations. But the problem is that, first of all, you need to having data about R obs means you can essentially only use simulated data for this method. And the other problem is that the setup, it depends on an assumption that phi observation is close to phi model, and that's illustrated in the loss function when the input to our model is the observed state. So, but this is not the prediction environment. So when we make predictions, when we solve the equation above, the input to our model is actually the modeled state, not the observed state. And the modeled state has bias in it. So as a result, the parameters that we obtain from offline calibration are not actually the optimal parameters for prediction. They might be close to the optimal parameters if the model state is close to the observed state, but they're slightly off. And in the worst case, because of this process of nonlinear amplification of errors, the model we get out of offline calibration is actually unstable when we try to integrate it forward. So an alternative to offline calibration is to do a posteriori or online calibration. So in that mode, we find optimal parameters that minimize some function of the observed state. This G model, it could be just the identity function, right? We could just be minimizing the modeled state against the observed state, but we could also minimize some function of the observed state, such as just observations at the sea surface, for example. And the cost function requires making a prediction. So the a posteriori calibration is done in the prediction environment. So the downside of a posteriori online calibration is that it's relatively expensive. It either requires gradients of the model, which we essentially never have, or it requires using ensemble-based methods, which require many forward evaluations of the model. However, it does yield optimal parameters. So kind of by construction, it yields parameters that allow you to make stable predictions. And it also allows you to use indirect data, which is crucial. So you can use sparse and indirect data. So you don't have to have high fidelity observations of the right-hand side of our dynamical system. Instead, we can use sparse observations and data in order, and observations that are indirect to the prediction in order to calibrate the parameters. Okay, so that's what I mean by a posteriori calibration. I just like to emphasize that actually for ocean modeling, the problem is even harder than that, because we're not just interested in doing a single a posteriori calibration. We actually need to do a hierarchy of calibrations to make this feasible. So I'm kind of sketching out a vision. This is not achieved yet, but this is sort of one vision for how you might develop and calibrate a global ocean model. So in this vision, we would start by developing a model for vertical mixing that's on the left. And then we calibrate that model in a one-dimensional context at a resolution of 2 to 10 meters, and our source of data is simulated. The next step in the hierarchy is to move to the mesoscale context, and we calibrate a model for mesoscale mixing. The forward model that we're using to calibrate the parameters is a two-dimensional model. And the data is simulated again, this time potentially with the model of vertical mixing embedded in it. Finally, once you've completed that initial stage, then we can go to the global model and calibrate the mesoscale and the vertical mixing model together jointly at a resolution of 0.5 degree or 1 degree. And in that stage, we can use observed data. One thing I'm not mentioning, by the way, this talks about calibration, but another key component of this hierarchy is uncertainty quantification, which is necessary in order to make the calibrations at each subsequent stage feasible. Because when we go to the global context, we have to have relatively well-informed priors for all of our parameters in order for the calibration to succeed. Okay. Oh, yeah, we don't want to see that. Okay, so this sounds like an incredibly daunting task, and it is. But one thing that makes it possible is this amazing method for calibration called ensemble Kalman inversion. So ensemble Kalman inversion is a calibration method that allows us to do a posteriori calibration without gradients of the model. So typically the way we pose the problem is that we postulate that some function of the model state, which I'm calling G model, we call it the forward map, can be related to the data plus some uncertainty eta. And the problem is to find the optimal parameters that minimize the difference between the forward map and the observations. So what ensemble Kalman inversion does is we first generate a prior distribution for our parameters and we sample it. So on the right, I'm showing you, and I'm illustrating this process. So the initial ensemble is, I think it's orange. I apologize if I got that wrong because I'm colorblind. But the initial ensemble is a wide, a dispersed cloud of parameters. And then we iterate forward using an update formula that takes into account information, takes into account all of the elements of G model to update the parameters, and hopefully what's going to result in a collapse towards the optimal parameter values. And so this process, it's still expensive because it requires a lot of forward model evaluations, but it requires far fewer than a method like than a Monte Carlo method, for example. So on the figure on the right, we're calibrating 2 parameters, and we have an ensemble of around 20 or so. And each dot on that figure represents a forward evaluation of the model. So if we were calibrating a global model, this would we would have done something like 100 forward evaluations of the global model in order to find these optimal parameters. That's a lot of evaluations, but the reason why it's feasible is because each model evaluation can be done in isolation. So it's an embarrassingly parallel method, and we only have to bring all of the data together in order to do the parameter update. So essentially the cost of doing a calibration is dictated by the cost of one forward evaluation if we have enough computational resources to distribute the whole ensemble across some cluster, for example. So that's what makes it feasible. Another key aspect of our work at Klima is that we're developing cheap trainable models to facilitate this process. So this is just sort of a plug for the model we've developed at MIT. It's called Oceananigans. And the key aspect of Oceananigans is that it runs on GPUs. So we can run a single global, we can do a single forward evaluation of a global model on one GPU. So that means that the size of our ensemble is essentially dictated by the number of GPUs that we can afford. And yeah, so that's where we are. So now I'll go into I'll give you 2 examples. So I'll try to illustrate how we're making progress on this on the problem of global ocean calibration. I'm going to give you 2 examples. One of them is calibration of a boundary layer turbulence closure, and then next is a proof of concept in which we calibrated a global model for just 2 parameters in a limited limited observations. So the first problem, let's see how I'm doing on time. Yeah. Okay. So the first problem I'm going to present is using ensemble Kalman inversion to calibrate a model for boundary layer turbulence. So this is the first stage of the calibration hierarchy that I presented earlier. So in this problem, I have I've written my model in the bottom, or I've sketched it in the bottom right. It's a mixing length, a local mixing length closure, a local diffusive closure that uses the mixing length scaling. So LT is a mixing length, E is a turbulent kinetic energy, and together they form a diffusivity that acts on temperature. So the objective again is to find so the mixing length in particular has a lot of free parameters that are part of its model, and our objective is to find the optimal parameters so that the temperature equals the temperature from a large eddy simulation. One aspect of this problem that I'd like to emphasize is that if we attempted to do I think that this would fail if we tried to use a priori calibration. And the reason is because here, I think there's a movie. The reason is because in this problem, I'm cooling at the surface, which means that the large eddy simulation has convective plumes that sink and mix the boundary layer. And in this process, we actually find that the fluxes, the turbulent fluxes of temperature are up gradient. But the model that we've posed to model this process is down gradient. So there's no way to evaluate the fluxes produced by the model and obtain a diffusivity. In other words, if you tried to calculate the diffusivity in this problem, you'd find that it's negative in some areas. So a priori calibration actually fails for this problem, and you might conclude that a diffusive model is not a valid model for boundary layer turbulence. But nevertheless, we find that if we do this ensemble Kalman inversion, we're able to obtain a model that is accurate and can make accurate predictions. And the way that it does that is by the model actually has some bias in it. So if you look closely at the temperature profiles, especially the one all the way on the left, you'll see that the temperature prediction has a negative gradient, where in the LES, the gradient is either uniform or slightly positive. So it's mispredicting the temperature gradient, but that allows it to predict a flux of the correct sign, given that it's a local diffusive model, and thereby make a globally accurate prediction. And the salient thing, the nice thing is that a local diffusive model is much simpler than a non-local model. So we kind of show that we can trade a small amount of what I would say is almost trivial bias for an computationally efficient model. So that's one of the benefits of doing posteriori calibration, is that you can calibrate biased models. Okay, so the next example is a global calibration. This calibration isn't all that meaningful, but it's simply meant to illustrate, we have the technology to do it. In this calibration, we're running a global ocean model with a simple boundary layer turbulence closure and a Gent-McWilliams ready closure for mesoscale turbulence. And so in Gent-McWilliams ready, we have two, in the simplest conception of that mesoscale closure, there's two free parameters, the diffusivity, the GM diffusivity and the ready diffusivity. And we set up this problem so that we integrate the global model forward for 45 days. And then over the final 30 days of the model run, we take a time average. And then our loss function is the difference between a zonal slice taken from the echo state estimate, time average over 1 month, and the state of the global model. And we only have 6 ensemble members because that's all we could afford for this. But because there's only the number of ensemble members scales with the number of parameters you have. So because there's only two parameters, the calibration nevertheless succeeds. And the animation is showing the standard deviation of temperature across the ensemble as a function of the Ecke iteration. So it's just illustrating model consensus that we find optimal parameter value, and the models all converge towards each other. Okay, so those are my 2 examples. Okay, so this is my summary slide. So I hope I described a posteriori calibration. People refer to it as online calibration of ocean models. And also hopefully argued, just from a theoretical standpoint, why a priori calibration is flawed, though it's very tempting because it's much easier. And so my pitch is that we should all be striving towards a framework where we're always doing a posteriori or online calibration. And we should also come up with a better word because it's not English, and I find it hard to say. So, and online is flawed too. So if we can come up with a better word for a posteriori calibration, that'd be good as well. So I showed you how we're kind of trying to move towards doing a posteriori calibration. And I think there's a lot of challenges that still remain. I showed how we sort of attempt to solve all these challenges, yet I think that this technology is still not very mature. So one issue is that we need cheap models, cheap software that can run quickly, ideally with very limited resources, in order to afford large ensembles of forward evaluations. We've been working a lot on tweaks and optimizations of the ensemble common inversion method itself. For example, choosing the step size, how to what good priors might be, etc. So those methods are maturing, but I think they could still use some more work. And of course, this whole procedure requires a huge amount of synthetic data and real observations as well. And that's a challenge to curate all of those and figure out what data is most informative. So I have links to the software that we've developed for solving this problem, and be happy to discuss. I think there's a lot of opportunities for collaboration between people here on this kind of work. So thanks.
Thanks a lot, Greg. So any questions for Greg? Yes, Pedram.
Hey, great talk. So I'm wondering what would you do with this approach when the current parameterization, if they have major structural uncertainties? So you can calibrate them, but you are not going to get to the results you want. So have you tried like learning from libraries or other things that would allow you to like explore like a functional space?
Well, so I only showed one parameterization for boundary layer turbulence, and on mesoscale turbulence, we haven't made very much progress at all. So I'd say that no, we haven't explored exotic. You're talking about how we formulate the model itself, right? We haven't made much progress on that. But I guess the thing is that so for example, for calibrating boundary layer turbulence, the boundary layer turbulence closure, I have a setup where I can create n ensemble members, and as long as I know what my free parameters are, then once the data is all set up, I sort of have a pipeline for calibrating the parameterization, and I can apply that pipeline to many different parameterizations. So I think one nice thing about it is that it's very flexible. Like if we can just drop in a new parameterization, then we can try something new. I think in terms of models with structural error, I think that's what you're referring to. If a model has structural error, it's harder to calibrate, but that doesn't always mean that the calibration fails. So the example with cat key, that model does have structural error. That's because it's local and diffusive. But nevertheless, the calibration often succeeds. The GM ready calibration, there's a ton of structural error in that problem, but we still find, we can consistently find optimal values for the diffusivities. So I think that's actually a nice property of ECI, is that it's able to calibrate bias models some of the time.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I meant like in general, not for a specific problem, but yeah, thanks.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, Paul, again.
Thanks, Greg. I mean, you've posed a nice example with the diffusivity, and you're arguing that says we should use a posteriori calibration, but I mean, to me, it says, well, actually, it really is important to do both offline and online, because that is a way to detect a fundamentally flawed model, right? I don't know that we want to be using models that are just totally physically wrong for a problem in a situation where we're going to have to generalize to different climates, right? And I understand what you're saying. Okay, this is a minimal bias in this case, and we understand it well enough, but yeah, I'm not sure. I think your example actually would argue for me we need to at least do both types of calibration so as we avoid using physically flawed models. Anyway, I'd be interested in your reaction to that.
Yeah, so I think I think what I'm saying is sort of it is a little bit provocative, especially because people have been a focus on adding non-local fluxes to boundary layer turbulence models has been a theme for decades. I think what I'm trying to point out is that although, like, from a theoretical standpoint, and it's easy to calculate directly that the fluxes have a non-local character in the problem, it's nevertheless possible to make accurate predictions, even predictions that extrapolate. We can still make predictions that extrapolate with a biased model, and the fact of the matter is that all of the so I agree with you that we should always be trying to reduce model bias for sure, but we also have to be practical, because we'll never have a perfect boundary layer turbulence model. So we always have to accept some amount of bias, and so it's important to sort of, I think, ask the real question, which is the model predictive, regardless of whether there's a bias that we can point to as a scientist and say, here's the problem. I don't know if that was coherent, but that's my attempt to answer your.
I've lost my last, thank you, Craig. I've lost my last question. Isaac, there is another question. Isaac.
Hi, Greg. In a way, though, thinking about the climate problem and couple that with ocean calibration, I can think of what you're doing as a priori calibration of an ocean model, because you're not looking at the biases that result from a fully coupled model. So it's in the eye of the beholder whether what you're doing is a priori or a posteriori, I think. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think right. So I can only be ideologically pure if I claim that I'm eventually going to do a coupled model calibration with an atmospheric model on top of the ocean. That might be, I think that's true. I guess, yeah, if just getting to the global ocean calibration is not sufficient to make climate predictions. So I guess at the point that I got to the global ocean calibration, I'm still in the a priori context, assuming that I know what the fluxes are from the atmosphere, essentially.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Well, now that we're talking about ideological purity, I think that might be a good moment for a break. So thanks again, Greg and the Lemontree team. And I propose that we reconvene in 5 minutes. So start again at 13 minutes past the hour, whichever country you're in. Okay, so see you in 5. And maybe if the M squared lines people are here, Greg, yeah, very good. Thanks, Greg.
We're here, and Brandon is the one that in control
Okay,
of this.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks,
Right,
Bob.
okay, so yeah, I hope they should be, all security should be fine to share screens, but I do think it's right to give people a chance to unload and reload. So be back in a couple of minutes.
Hey, just to clarify, I assume the screen share is working.
Oh yeah. Thanks,
Yeah.
Brandon. Yes, yeah, it looks great. All
Okay.
logos are visible, and it's it looks perfectly fine to me. So this one is going to be, I think, a tag team from various people from N Squared Lines, but is more extended, more like the discussion, hopefully a discussion and a longer consideration of ocean mixing and patterns of warming, and going from theory to modeling, hopefully. So over to you, Brandon, and I'm really looking forward to this.
Okay, great. So actually, it's gonna be me starting. So
Fine.
yeah, so thanks a lot, Colm. Yeah. So as Colm mentioned, it's gonna be a joint talk between Brandon, Alistair, and myself. And actually, the bulk will be very much a presentation of some work done by Akash Sane at Princeton GFDL, one of the early carrier researchers as part of N Squared Lines. So if we could go to the next slide, please, Brandon. Super, thanks. Okay, so just to kind of tell you a little bit where we're going for the next extended slot that we were given. So M Squared Line was kind of given the great task of presenting some kind of combination of big picture, focusing on an important topic, and also present some of the challenges. Since Paul O'Gorman talked about some of the atmospheric parameterization work at the last cross-vestry meeting, and as part of the journal club, you discussed ocean mixing, we thought it would be a great opportunity to kind of explain why ocean mixing is important, why the parameterization, so as Greg mentioned, in climate models are actually affecting some of the simulations that we have. And then Brandon is going to really present kind of an extended discussion of the current parameterization of, in particular, vertical mixing in ocean model, really state-of-the-art parameterization, and how we've been augmenting those existing physics-based parameterizations with data and machine learning, and showing some kind of exciting new result in global ocean models. And so Alistair will then take over, talk a little bit of the outlook and some of the challenges. And I think some of it was discussed by Greg. It's kind of need to kind of find the right physics. We also need to make sure that the simulation is being improved by not deteriorating the rest of the system. So we're going to go through that a little bit. So next one, Brandon, please. Okay, so apologies for those of you who've been on this call quite a few times, but since there are always new members, we thought kind of starting with a little bit of background is always useful. So the three maps at the top here are basically sea surface temperature biases, or sea surface temperature errors, between different coupled climate models and observations. And here we're looking at sea surface temperature. And basically without picking at a single model, but there are some common biases, so there are some common errors. So I think Greg mentioned one in the Southern Ocean, right, in terms of mixed layer depth. If you look at sea surface temperature in those simulations, usually there's kind of a cold blue spot in the North Atlantic, and it pops up in pretty much every climate model, bias plot that you would make. So it's been persistent and been around for a while, and this is kind of some of the biases that we're trying to target in M Squared Line. So those biases, those errors come from, again, as mentioned in the previous talk by Greg as well, numerics, right? So that could be one of them, is we need to approximate equations, but also parameterization. All the processes that are happening below the grid box size of the climate models that are either poorly represented or not represented at all. And a combination of them can actually give rise to those errors. So in M Squared Lines, we're really trying to focus on those kind of subgrid processes for the ocean, sea ice, and atmosphere. So really trying to target all of those. But today we're going to talk only about the ocean. So next one, Brandon, please. Okay, so this is really kind of the, where we come from. I'm a physical oceanographer, and so are, Brandon and Alistair. And we've been kind of, looking at this problem for a while. So the two maps on top are projections of thermospheric sea level rise in climate models. So the left map, and the right map is the spread from those coupled climate models. So just looking at a pattern, right? So basically, most models respond roughly the same way. Sea level, the thermospheric component of sea level and the dynamic sea level components, are basically experiencing changes due to ocean circulation, due to forcing, and we understand the physics actually pretty well. But now if you wanted to actually understand the magnitude of those changes, then the models are all over the place. And the places where you get the largest amplitudes are also the places where you get the largest spread. So basically the map on the right, kind of the blue blob again, or the kind of green blob in the North Atlantic. So places where you have the largest biases in climate simulations are the places where you get actually the largest signature in patterns of warming, in patterns of sea level rise, but also the largest spread. So where the models actually disagree in their projections of climate change. So you have this kind of successions of model biases under controlled climate, largest response under climate change, and largest spread or largest disagreements across the models. And so on the same slide here, basically at the bottom is if we take a bunch of different models and we make them experience the same climate change forcing, and we try to decompose where is this spread coming from? Why are the model giving us so many different results, even though they're experiencing now the same forcing? And so without going into the details, but basically it comes down to all those mixing parameterizations. Right. So, and this is something pretty critical. And again, Greg, kind of alluded at a few of them, how we mix vertically, how we actually mix, in the ocean interior. All of this will actually impact how we stratify the ocean, how the heat will be taking up, and how the patterns of sea level would look like in the future. And it all comes down to those kind of subgrid parameterization that we have in the current generation of climate model. So next, Brendan. So really kind of trying to actually, understand projections of ocean warming and patterns of warming and reduce the spread, or at least understand where the spread is coming from. We've been trying to tackle different parameterization in M² line by using data and physics and different ML models. So this is kind of a little bit of, the type of framework that we've been using. It's a little bit all over the place, you could say, but actually it's pretty targeted. So sometimes we have a pretty good understanding of one physics, approximation, which is the interior ocean is adiabatic. And that's this kind of mesoscale parameterization that Greg talked about. But the parameterization itself is actually quite unknown, and the transport itself is unknown. So for mesoscale eddies, so that's work led by Dhruv Balwada, is keeping kind of the if you want, what's kind of the framework of Jent McWilliams by assuming the ocean is adiabatic, but learning the subgrid transport directly from data. So that's one way to try to actually improve the kind of the representation of mesoscale eddies while remaining faithful to the physics. On the extreme on the right, what I call the kitchen sink, it's a little bit of the everything that we don't know. So one strategy we've been using is using data assimilation increment, which is the error between the coarse resolution model with the parameterization and observations themselves. And so we've been trying to learn that error to try to understand what's going on. Another idea to, again, kind of try to reduce model biases and kind of capture the essence of the physics that we're missing sometimes in models is this ideas of backscatter, the inverse energy cascade. So we take energy from the small scale and it kind of basically go upscale. So we've been kind of trying to discover equations from data to try to capture that. And so, so sometimes we rely on the physics and, try to augment the parameterization with data. And sometimes we just, don't have anything to rely on. So we try to really use the data by itself to kind of augment the physics across the model. So today, what we're going to do is actually talk about something on the left-hand side of this plot, which is kind of trying to learn the parameter structure. So Brandon is going to go after basically vertical mixing, where there is a strong, and well-grounded parameterization that has been developed by Brandon and others, and actually try to learn some of the ad hoc coefficients in that parameterization with data. And so I'm going to pass it on to Brandon.
All right, thank you very much. There we go. So I don't think I have to do too much more to motivate why the ocean surface boundary layer is particularly important for simulating coupled climate. Of course, getting the mixing on both sides of the boundary layer, both in the atmosphere and in the ocean, is very important for getting these exchanges of important properties like heat and gases between the atmosphere and eventually the ocean interior. Ultimately, these turbulent fluxes are not resolved by the model, so they need to be parameterized. So what I'm representing here is a vertical turbulent flux as this W prime lambda prime bar term. This is some arbitrary quantity lambda. It could be salt, temperature, carbon, something like this. And it's basically being represented as some functional form F here, which depends on things like the property lambda itself, or some physical parameters that represent the physical processes that actually govern the mixing in the ocean. So if you had a chance to read the review article that we had posted, you learned a little bit about some of these processes, such as the shear instabilities, convective instabilities. On the ocean side, we also have waves that drive things like Langmuir circulations that Greg talked about a little bit, as well as breaking waves at the surface. So yeah, so basically the primary problem here is that the functional fit for representing these fluxes dependent on these processes remains uncertain, as well as what processes should actually even be represented within the parentheses on the right-hand side here. And of course, the details matter significantly for our coupled atmosphere ocean climate simulations. Now, when I think about the ocean boundary layer parameterization problem, I think about it a lot in terms of kind of a cost versus complexity problem, where if we had all the resources in the world, it would be great to run our GCM like a large eddy simulation model, resolve all the important turbulence scales that lead to these fluxes. But of course, this is not something that we're going to be able to do within the foreseeable future. So the alternative approach that we've had to deal with is to come up with various schemes or these parameterizations that were represented by F on the previous slide, which could be very simple, something like just a constant eddy mixing coefficient everywhere. Now we know that that's not very physically robust, or they can be much more complex where you add additional equations to try to actually simulate some of the approximate statistics of the turbulent quantities themselves. Ultimately, there's kind of a delicate balance here between representing these complex physical processes versus having these sort of cheap and numerically robust algorithms that we need when we're simulating a climate model for hundreds of years. And of course, the climate model introduces its own sort of suite of numerical constraints that we might need to think about, especially things like conservation, but also sensitivity and stability. So you don't want a scheme that's going to be particularly sensitive to having a long time step or a coarse vertical grid. And I don't need to touch on this last point at all after the nice talk that Greg just gave. But of course, the approach of calibrating these functions is going to be very vital. So the schemes I'm going to refer to a little bit today include schemes like KPP, which we actually just talked about in the Journal Club a couple of weeks ago. So anyone that was there for that should be pretty familiar with the ideas. The scheme that we've been developing here at GFDL is known as EPBL. It's distinct from KPP in some ways that we think are very important for the way that this scheme behaves for applying it in the boundary layer problem. And ultimately, what I'm going to be discussing today is how we are trying to use some ideas that come from sort of the second moment closure type parameterizations to improve our EPBL parameterization even more to better represent the physics and the mixing in our climate model. So just really quickly, one last thing to motivate where I'm going to go with this. We have all these different approaches. And so there might be, you know, a simple question. We have all these different approaches. They're usually calibrated against similar data sets, observations, LES models, for example. Well, do they at least give consistent results when you put them in a similar framework? And a short answer is no. So this is a paper, probably a few people on this call were involved in a few years ago, where we ran a suite of single column models with what were essentially the state-of-the-art ocean mixing parameterizations. And what I'm showing is the difference of the mixed layer depth in those simulations from the ensemble mean. And you can see there's a lot of red and blue there, indicating that the models tend to disagree in a lot of regions. And you might say, well, which one looks more like the observations? These are column models, so of course we don't actually have observations. If we want to compare to observations, we need to include horizontal processes, and then actually tracing the biases back to individual parts of the model becomes very challenging. So it's not simple to pick which is best. So the approach that we're taking is we're actually working with our EPBL approach, and we're trying to think about things that we think the more complicated second, or more, I guess, physically motivated second moment closure models do well, and take some of those ideas to hopefully start to reduce some of the inconsistencies between some of the parameterizations. So just to really quickly introduce the basic concepts that we've utilized in developing this EPBL scheme, one of the things we've utilized quite a bit, and in EPBL, the E stands for energetics. PBL is planetary boundary layer. So we've really emphasized keeping track of the energetics and energetic consistency as is relevant in turbulent boundary layers. So basically, if you look at a column of ocean water, specifically a stably stratified column of ocean water, you're going to have denser water at the bottom and lighter water at top. What this means is that the center of mass is going to be somewhere down in the lower half of the water column, simply because you have more of the heavy water down towards the bottom. And when you eventually, something happens, a process drives mixing of this column, you're going to mix up that density. So you're going to get, you're going to mix up the temperature and salinity, which leads to a pretty much uniform density in the column. This uniform density means that now you've moved some of this lighter water down and some of the heavier water up. What this means is you've moved the center of mass up, so you've increased the potential energy. But we all know, from pretty basic physical principles that if you are increasing potential energy, you had to pay an energy cost somewhere. So basically, this means that we have sort of a cost to mix that we can use as a constraint on the intensity and extent of turbulent boundary layers. This principle has been well understood for a long time, of course, and applied to boundary layer developments for many decades. So you can go all the way back to some of the first attempts at this, the bulk boundary layer approach. And here the assumption that's made is that the entire boundary layer is pretty much uniform in all properties, including temperature and salinity, which leads to a uniform density. This was popular because you didn't have as many degrees of freedom to represent structure in the ocean back then. And it's also not too far from the truth when you have a pretty well mixed surface layer. So you can trace back then an equation to the energetics of the system. So from basically first principles here that predicts how this boundary layer depth might change in time due to the basically the injection of energy from turbulence generating processes like mechanical forcing that can include things like the wind, surface waves, as well as buoyancy effects, which could resist mixing if you have a stabilizing buoyancy flux, or also can contribute to entrainment when you have convective or destabilizing buoyancy fluxes. And so basically you have this entrainment velocity, which I represent here as WE, which is predicted by these quantities in particular. And this would then predict if the boundary layer is going to get deeper or shallower in time. This was common in previous generation ocean models that use density coordinates, as I just mentioned. Now, of course, we know that the boundary layer is not perfectly homogeneous. So we need to be able to actually represent some of the structure of the physical properties of the model in the boundary layer to better simulate both the boundary layer evolution as well as the exchange of variables. And so this could be things like physics and dynamics in the boundary layer. Also, of course, if you're coupling to a biogeochemical model, you need to know something about the nutrients within this layer and how they vary. So we end up with these z-coordinate type models that require now to have a continuous vertical flux profile. So we can no longer rely on this entrainment velocity approach. And kind of a very simple way to get a vertical flux profile comes from this concept of eddy diffusivity, which Greg actually just talked about a bit. Of course, one of the things that was pointed out is that the eddy diffusivity model is not always perfect, but it is turned out to be kind of a very nice, simple first starting point here. And so this is where we're starting for our work as well, where we assume that the vertical profile of the flux is proportional to the mean gradient. So that's the dz lambda term all the way on the right here. And I'm representing the diffusivity as nu sub lambda here. And we're going to combine this eddy diffusivity model now with that bulk energetic framework. And this is the key idea behind the EPBL scheme, which what we do differently than what I showed on the last slide is now we can actually resolve the vertical structure of where you have that turbulent kinetic energy being converted to potential energy by mixing. So that's what's happening on the left-hand side here. That max of n squared means this is being done where we have stable stratification. And on the right-hand side, you can also see, I've shown the mechanical forcing term being the same. We could talk more about that. I'll save that for another time. The buoyancy production term, then also you can see the min of n squared and 0. This means basically when you have negative n squared, you have unstable water. So you actually can supply turbulent kinetic energy because you have heavier water over light water in that situation, which wants to come into an equilibrium. All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the things that Greg also briefly mentioned, which is how we actually then model the eddy diffusivity to use it within this EPBL approach. So there's sort of a very general framework for an eddy diffusivity that's often given when you look at any of the literature on this topic, where the eddy diffusivity is equal to a coefficient given here as C lambda, an eddy velocity, which could be a function of depth. I'm showing it as V star here, and an eddy length, which I'm giving as L here, which could also be a function of depth. Now, what first order schemes, so things like KPP and how we've done things in EPBL so far do, is they actually introduce essentially a scale velocity, which I'm showing now in the equation on the bottom left as V star 0, a scale height, which I'm setting as the boundary layer depth HBL here. And this all gets multiplied by what's assumed to be a universal vertical shape function that relates these scale values to the diffusivity profile. And so you can see this in the graphs here, that the eddy diffusivity would be proportional to however you derive that velocity scale, multiplied by this constant shape function that's basically assumed to be the same everywhere, no matter where you are. So the other way we can do an eddy diffusivity model, though, is we can follow on how the second moment closures do things. The second moment closures are a little bit more complex and demanding in the sense that they introduce additional physical prognostic quantities that you simulate, which essentially attempt to represent the evolution of turbulence in the water column. And so basically what I'm showing in the bottom left here now is that now the eddy diffusivity from the second moment closure can be related to basically a turbulent velocity scale. And I apologize if this gets too far into the weeds, but what you need to know is that we have a turbulent velocity scale and a turbulent length scale that we're now predicting using additional prognostic equations. Here they're coming from what would be the turbulent kinetic energy, which is given by K, and a dissipation rate length scale, which is given by epsilon here. And what you can see immediately when we look at the eddy diffusivity predicted by this second moment closure model is that it actually varies considerably. So here I'm showing a number of boundary layers that are at different latitudes. And you can see the structure of the eddy diffusivity actually varies significantly. So if I just normalize these now to get what we would consider to be a shape function, you can see very clearly that the idea of a universal shape function is not supported by what the second moment closure is predicting. So now I'm going to start to walk through how we're going to use machine learning and specifically neural networks to try to better represent what we think are fairly reasonable ideas and predictions coming out of the second moment closure in our first order parameterization. And again, I need to give a big shout out to the postdoc who's done a lot of the heavy lifting on this work. This is Akash Sani, pictured here. And so now what Akash has been doing is he's been working to build neural networks that are going to be able to predict the variability of this shape function based on a set of input parameters. In particular, what we've found are the important input parameters for predicting the variability of the shape function are things like the boundary conditions of the problem, so the wind forcing or potentially the buoyancy forcing, as well as the latitude and the boundary layer depth. Of course, waves are something that we're also going to be layering in soon, so I've also included that here. So once we build this first neural network that's able to predict the variability of the shape function, we also need to think about how we're going to represent this velocity scale. And so we're actually doing this by having a second neural network. And this second neural network is predicting the value of this V star 0 term that I just showed, which is essentially related to the amplitude of these diffusivity profiles. And it's dependent on a similar set of inputs, so wind, convection, and latitude now. And again, it's something that we can also add waves into at some point in the future to better represent how that layers into this. So the next step, once we have these neural networks formed, is to simply combine them and use them to reconstruct the eddy diffusivity profile. So we now have a new basically model for getting V star 0 and this shape function G here. And we're going to replace this within the existing energetics framework that I told you about that we've emphasized in the development of the EPBL scheme. And so by doing it this way, we're only replacing this, what I'm showing now is nu sub D in this equation at the bottom right here, with the predictions from the neural network. But it still obeys all the same energetic consistencies that we've emphasized for EPBL. And this has a very nice advantage of essentially ensuring that we'll have the same sort of stability and conservation properties of the original model, as well as the same energetic governance. And so this ends up being a bit more, I think, straightforward when you go for the implementation phase and avoiding any sorts of feedbacks and kind of instabilities. So now I'm going to really quickly walk through the training data and approach and show some results from actually implementing this in a GCM. So all of this relies on these one-dimensional second moment closure eddy diffusivity models, which we've taken advantage of this nice piece of software out there called Gotham that's able to basically do all these simulations in a pretty small amount of time, considering the complexity that is represented. And so Akash has done all of these simulations, and from the results of the simulation, he's able to then derive the normalized shape functions and the velocity scales. The training procedure is all very standard, using sort of the community software and community procedures, things like PyTorch. Now, one of the key points that I need to point out is actually how we're going to implement this in MOM6. And the way he's come up with for doing this is that we're actually going to then store the weights and biases of the networks in netCDF files. And then we've simply modified the MOM6 code with Fortran code that's able to reproduce the neural network predictions. And we plug this right inside of EPBL in MOM6, and we replace the original shape function and velocity scales. And so you can see actually at the bottom an example of some of the offline validation. That's the third panel from the left there, where in two very different cases, it's able to do a nice job reproducing that eddy diffusivity profile. All right, now I'm finally going to wrap up by showing some of the results from using this in ocean-only mode climate simulations, or I guess ocean and sea ice to be more precise. So this is using GFDL's latest ocean and sea ice simulator, OM4, which is described in detail in this 2019 Adcroft et al. Paper. Except for the fact that we're now running these simulations using the second Ocean Model Intercomparison Project protocol. For those of you who know what that means, it just means we're using JRA 55 forcing so we can get closer to the present day, which helps when comparing our results to Argo. This version of MOM6 is configured with this Z coordinate near the surface. So we need to have good representation of these turbulent fluxes. And of course, it's using our EPBL mixing parameterization scheme. So now we have a control run with this sort of KPP-like shape function approach and a velocity scale I didn't describe in detail. And then we have the machine learning augmented run, which uses EPBL with the two neural networks for predicting both the shape function and velocity scale. And just some really quick results I'm showing here are that this actually has an impact on the ocean heat uptake in the model. So you can get that. Get the sense of that by looking at, for example, the global mean potential temperature that's in the bottom right, as well as the net heat flux into the ocean that's on the bottom left. So while these might look like very small differences, it's important to recognize that a few tenths of a watt per meter squared are significant when we're talking about things like the Earth's energy imbalance and the sensitivity to anthropogenic climate change. And I'm not going to focus too much on the sign of the change here. But I do now want to step into some of the specific results where we compare these to Argo now to look more directly at the stratification and how it affects things. So the first thing I'm going to show, this is actually a transect along, sorry, the x-axis here should say that this is the latitude. And it's a transect of the stratification along the Atlantic sector, so at 20 degrees west. And in the top, what I'm showing is the Argo observation, and the bottom left is the control run, and the bottom right is the neural network. And what you can very clearly say is that the control run actually had a very low stratification bias, just sort of in the subtropics that I've identified with the little circle here. And that low stratification bias was not consistent with what the Argo observations tell us we should see. When we ran the model with the neural networks, however, you can see that that low stratification bias primarily goes away. So this was an encouraging sign, something now we wanted to look a little bit further into how we can better measure how this is affecting the stratification in the model. And so then the next thing we looked at was the mixed layer depths in the model. So the first thing I'm going to show is the summer mixed layer depths. These are the shallower mixed layer depths that you see when you primarily have a lot of stabilizing forcing. On the left here, what you see is the comparison between the control run and the Argo simulation. So the top left in the sets of 3 panels is the model, the top right is Argo, and the bottom left is the difference between the two, where the purpler colors indicate deeper and the oranger indicate shallower. So you can see that we had some biases in the control run, including things like deeper mixed layer depths in the tropics that have been improved when we could go to the neural network run, which is shown in the right. And by looking at some of the integrated metrics of this, like the mean bias or the root mean square bias, you can see reduction of about 10% or so on those quantities, as well as an increase in the spatial R squared of these patterns on the order of going from 0.83 to 0.86. We can also look at the deep winter mixed layers. So these are the convectively driven mixed layers. And we also see similar improvements. The bias gets a little bit worse, but the root mean square bias also goes down here. And looking at the spatial R squared, we see an improvement going from 0.62 to 0.674. One of the potential areas of improvements that I really want to highlight is the Labrador Sea, where you can see that this deep bias in the model is reduced in the neural network run at the right. This is really important for those of you who are not familiar, because the Labrador Sea is an area of very important deep water formation in the ocean, and being able to get that in the simulations is critical. So now I want to just sort of wrap up with a quick summary of what I just talked about. So hopefully I've convinced you that ocean mixing parameterizations must be improved for the sake of continuing to improve our ability to simulate weather and climate problems. There's a lot of current machine learning applications being investigated to improve simulation of the ocean surface boundary layer. So things like what I just talked about, the parameter calibration and uncertainty quantification, like what Greg just talked about. There's also approaches out there such as applying corrections to existing schemes. So we're looking into it using data assimilation as part of the M² Lines project. Klima has also just recently put out a nice description of some work they're doing on this problem. And there's potentially other approaches like replacing the flux parameterization altogether with a neural network, which I won't talk at all about now. There's a number of other prospects towards improving boundary layer simulations that are being investigated within the M² Lines project. So things like interpretability of the missing physics, whether that be with equation discovery or these approaches for combining the schemes with observations and data assimilation. A lot of work being done on improving parameterization of the role of mesoscale and submesoscale turbulence. There's a number of recent publications on that. Potentially connecting the horizontal and vertical, as well as the non-local fluxes in the ocean. And then we also really want to get into the work of enhancing the air-sea coupling between the atmosphere and the ocean vertical mixing parameterization, which is something we've just started talking about in detail. And so now I think if we have enough time, I'm going to hand it over to Alistair, who's going to chat for just a couple of minutes if Alistair is ready.
I am here. Yeah, so I won't take up too much time. We wanted to just sort of come back to a larger scale picture in terms of the general question of characterizations and how to implement them in GCMs. And there's sort of 3 broad discussion topics. I think there's, three themes which we could discuss at length, and a few minutes isn't going to be able to do them justice. But from the implementation point of view, they really do need to be thought about hard. So the first is that we often have a lot of interaction between processes that in reality, and in the code that is true also. And there tends to be information connections between the existing contemporary and conventional parameterizations. And you can see this, you can see this evolve in time in our codes. We often have a parameterization that was implemented initially as an idealized isolated process. And then over time, someone says, oh, we need to actually get some of that information out of it. And so you start adding variables to the APIs, to these parameterizations, and you start using those data inside other parameterizations. There's all this kind of cross, shall I say, I won't say contamination, but exchange of information between processes, which has implications for us when we're trying to apply some machine learning data-driven parameterization to GCMs, because we have to make sure that information is still available for the other parameterizations which we're not yet replacing. That need for information is kind of connected to the fact that there is a real physical interaction between the processes. And just to come back to the example that Brandon's just been talking about, we know in the ocean that there is an active restratification of the well-mixed layer by the mesoscale and sub-mesoscale eddies in the ocean. And we're very much aware at this point in time that it's an extremely strong balance, and it actually dominates a lot of the tuning that we have in our contemporary models. And so that's a real thing that we have to worry about. And the challenge we have is we often develop our parameterizations without the other processes present in the idealized NLES simulations. And so whether we're doing the right thing physically is one aspect. But we do need to represent these physical interactions properly. And then this last one in particular plays into the very often discussed issue of compensating errors. And so if our parameterizations don't get these physical interactions right, if they're not represented at all, or if they're just kind of arbitrarily added just because of the way you just did things in the model, calling things in a certain order, your model is going to have a challenge getting the right solution. And we often tune the model, and I'm using the word tune here, should I say honestly, because that's what we do. After we tune the model, and we often balance errors in one parameterization, either because the parameterization is no good or because it's missing some interaction with another process, in order to minimize our overall errors. And that's what we refer to as the compensating errors, that we're balancing errors in one place by changing a parameterization that shouldn't really be having to do that job. So just broadly speaking, that's sort of the three themes which I think can be separated and thought about at length. And we could. I mean, I'm worrying about whether we should go on to the next slide, because the next slide is really about implementation, and the second pass to the implementation, which is really about our own project. Actually, let's do that, Brandon. Let's just move on. So M squared lines. Oh, is it? There it is. Yeah. So M squared lines is aiming to improve existing climate models, and so this puts up some other aspects, other challenges for our machine learning parameterization work. And some of them are very, very straightforward and technical in the sense that you're easy to describe, and those are things such as a language barrier, language meaning computer language. Most of our climate models, Oceanigan is a new exception, and Klima being a new exception, are written in Fortran, and yet most of machine learning is done in more modern languages, Julia and Python and JAX and so on. And so we have this issue of how do we actually take advantage of how do we implement machine learning and take advantage of the networks in these models. But we actually have quite a few examples coming online where we've actually managed to deal with this. And some of them have been very straightforward implementations of neural networks in Fortran. So for example, Yuval, the MIT group have taken this approach. And in fact, the work that you've just heard about by Akash Sani, he did exactly the same thing. He just coded up the network in Fortran. I believe it took him a few days to get it right, and then it was done. And so for networks which aren't too large, this is definitely a viable approach, and it means that we can use these things readily in GCMs. There's also more abstract and generalizable approaches, which will allow us to use more complicated architectures, network architectures, and those are using interfaces to other languages. And for example, Fortran Keras Bridge is one, which actually reach more conventional networks, but then 4Pi literally just interface to Python, so you can do anything you can do in Python, you can call from Fortran code. And SmartSim is a product from HPE, Hewlett-Packard Enterprises that is really quite general and very well structured, and looks like it's going to be very scalable, and it's something we're currently working on implementing. So these actually are things we've all tried, and we're in the middle of wrapping up the SmartSim implementation so we can do an evaluation on this. But there was a summer school that ICCS ran where they discussed at length some package that they're developing, which is very similar to 4Pi, I believe. And so this is something that is something that needs to continue because we do need to make this part of what we do easier and more generalizable. But then the other issue is to do with hardware, and this, I think this is worth discussing because, as we said, our aim is to improve existing climate models, and those models currently do not take advantage or even run on GPUs. So there is a challenge, which is that the networks tend to work very efficiently on GPUs, partly because GPUs are very, have been somewhat designed. They're naturally good at handling the math of networks. And our deep learning networks can be quite expensive, and so it becomes necessary to use a GPU to actually do the inference step. Now, the good news is that it looks like most of the US climate centers will be getting access to GPU hardware in the next year or two, or I'll put years, not being able to be certain about these things. But I think that it is something that we can actually consider, that there will be access to GPUs in time for running climate runs with machine learned parameterizations in them. But nevertheless, just because you've got a fast chip that can handle it is not an excuse. This is a message I've directed primarily at our own team, that we should not be building exceptionally expensive and deep and big networks, because after all, there is still a cost. And we need to actually be prudent, because we're going to eventually be wanting to have a lot of these networks running on these GPUs. And we just have to be practical about this. So far, it looks like we've been able to do quite well. The cost of running a caches network in Fortran is just a few percent of the overall model, and comparable. It is more expensive, but comparable to the original EVPL scheme. And after all, it was just a formula for diffusivity and shape, and now it's a network. But it is viable, and what we've seen of importing other parameterizations that have been developed elsewhere, for example, some from Zana's group, we're finding that we can afford to do these on GPUs, on single GPUs attached to our HPCs. So that's just some comments about the implementation aspect of this. And I think actually we should really stop on the previous slide, Brandon, just so we can end there. So I feel like there's lots of aspects about the implementation that can be discussed, and a few minutes really isn't enough to really get into them, but I'll leave it at that.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Alistair. Yes, I'd quite like to hear the
yeah, I think we should
do the half hour on the implementation. Maybe I'll twist you on to do that another time. So questions about what we've heard today? Okay, so everybody's, I'll kick off. Oh, Greg, perfect. Greg, off you go.
Hi, thanks for that. That was great, both Brandon and Alistair. I think I have some questions and comments. One comment is, I guess I'll start with the comment since you don't have to respond to that. I think like the question of compensating errors, that's exactly what the purpose of doing like this hierarchical calibration, that's what it's meant to address, right? It's like we develop parameterizations in isolation, but they also interact with one another, and they have to ingest a biased model state and then make an accurate prediction. So the hope, that's, I hope that, that's something that this framework that I've discussed can help with.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And this is why I would like to have, it is something we should discuss. So I totally agree that, an automated approach is extremely powerful and it can solve a lot of problems. But there's also the issue that sometimes a parameter shouldn't be changed. So, this is where, the parameterizations were built to do a particular task. And if you start using it just because it happens to be able to compensate for something, it's not something we should be doing necessarily.
Right.
So it's just,
I guess so.
It's a powerful tool and very useful, but we also have to be judicious in how we use it. I think
so. My answer to that a key part of the process is using the concept of prior information as we go from stage to stage in the hierarchy.
Sure.
So when we're at a process level, very idealized context, we typically have wide priors. We have no idea what the parameters should be. But then when we get to the global model, we can say, using some systematic techniques, that the parameter value can be between 0.5 and 0.7. But if it's outside those ranges, then it's not physical anymore. That's a way of like making it systematic. Doesn't mean that it solves the problem, but I think there's at least a path. Yeah. Okay. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, Simon. We can't hear you. Still can't hear you.
While we're waiting for Simon, Brandon, put up your conclusion slide.
The question I wanted to ask, while Simon's still trying to deal with his IT, is it was very interesting to hear Greg and Brandon talk, and it's kind of like a high level thing. Is this reinventing the wheels, or is it complementary? Is the work complementary? Brandon?
Yeah, so I mean, I can't speak for Greg on this, but I would say that a lot of the things that we've been working on here are going to be very complementary to each other, just both in terms of thinking about how you can build these things into like sort of very robust physical constraints, like what we've focused on now, but then this approach for sort of layering in, and I don't think this was something he talked about, but one of their latest works is how you might then layer in sort of corrections for the remaining biases to the flux, is another nice piece of work coming out from sort of this approach that they've been doing. So I think at the end of the day, everything's going to be highly complementary, but yeah.
Great. Okay. Thank you. So Simon, any chance of sound? No. All right. Okay. Laura, what did you?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of second that, right? I think a lot of the work is very complementary, and I think there's a lot of kind of synergies that are possible here. Whether it's under calibration or tuning, as one want to call. And I think, again, within M²9, there are just so many kind of processes and interactions that we're looking at that none of them are actually learned in isolation. So I think that's where we can actually think a little bit bigger in terms of how we can actually, enhance the simulation, not just focusing on one process at a time, but really taking a global view of it.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Though I'm loath to keep us all for longer than 2 hours. I mean, there was another question which is very good that Alistair said to bring this up. I mean, the beautiful stuff that Brandon talked about the EPBL is still to some extent philosophically associated with the KPP idea, right? You are going to the next step beyond looking at variable shape functions and so on. And whereas you're saying that the other models that you might do is completely replace the parameterization with neural nets, for example. So I mean, what do you think is the best way forward? If you could only do one thing, Brandon, what would you be doing?
I mean, so maybe I shouldn't have even put in that fourth bullet on there at the top, because I think the work that we've done, tells you what we think is the best way to go forward, where we combine what we know as scientists, what we know from physical principles, with the great advantages that the machine learning techniques can give us, and the complexities that we've struggled with for a while that a neural network can then deal with very quickly. And of course, we're not done with this yet. We want to now continue on this with ideas like equation discovery and see if we can understand what makes the network work so well. So yeah, I hope that sort of answers your question.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so I noticed Oh, yes,
And-
Dominic.
Sorry,
please.
just one like tiny comment from me really on the implementation side. I mean, this continues to be something we're looking at within ICCS. It's sort of the different techniques there are for integrating basically Fortran code with these kind of Python libraries, TensorFlow, PyTorch, and looking at exactly the right mechanisms to do this, to sort of squash out as much performance from that layer as possible. And I was going to ask, how's the computational performance and what you've been doing, Brandon? But I think basically Alistair sort of answered that for me by saying, it's sort of a bit worse than the normal parameterization. And one thing we're kind of keen to do is to really make sure we know exactly the best way to sort of deal with that interface with the highest performance as possible. So we're continuing to work on that, and we have libraries for that, as mentioned, that we talked about at the summer school, and we'll kind of be following up with everyone, I think, at various points.
I believe Jack and Cheng have already connected.
Exactly, yeah. So
Yeah.
we're already having these conversations.
Yeah.
And yeah, Simon's just put something on the chat about that as well. Yeah.
So that seems great. Yes, Simon's managed to get his point across in the chat. There's already the conversations between ICCS, Vesri Core, and the other bit and the other teams, and we've heard some great accessible science talks today, really telling us about the sort of things that's happening. So I look forward to doing this the next time. And Dominic has also put in the link, another plug for another conference that we will be hosting here in Cambridge. So thank you to everyone for the participation, particularly thank you to all the presenters, and hope to see you all soon, and enjoy the rest of your day in whichever time zone you happen to be. So thanks a lot, everyone. Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.